This is my all-time favorite painting. It was made in 1913 by Italian artist Umberto Boccioni. It's a hefty 6.5 square feet and completely hypnotizing. Today the painting lives at the New York MoMA, where I was lucky enough to see it in person a few years ago. I have no idea how long I stood there. It could have been over an hour or just 15 minutes. Any ability to gauge time melted out of my brain, while this weird art-struck experience I was having drew in other people from across the room. When I first stumbled across the painting that day on the top floor of the museum, I actually didn't know it was going to be there, but even before seeing it, I already knew it was my favorite painting. I had seen one of the artist's sculptures before, at the San Francisco MoMA when I was a teenager, which started my dive into the Futurist art movement. Boccioni's bronze sculpture, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, looks like an abstracted human figure, but it's meant to represent the volumes of air and atmosphere that gets distorted as the man's stride cuts through 3D space. It's so funky and perfect, and I don't know, it's just so sick. Even when I've seen other quote-unquote great paintings, especially historical ones, I usually need someone who understands it better to kind of uplift it for me. But when it comes to Boccioni's body of work, I feel like I immediately get it. Or everything about his painting seems instantly communicated, and I don't feel like I need help. Here's a series he made in 1911, and keep in mind this is well over 100 years ago. The first of the series is set in a train station. It's busy, vibrant, full of life and sound. The engine of the train pulling in, the shriek of the whistle. Crowds swarming on the platform, couples embracing as they say goodbye to one another, while lines of passengers move down the platform, pushing against each other to get their luggage on the train before it sets off. In the second painting, the chaos has settled and the passengers have taken their seats. The train has long pulled out of the station, leaving behind all the chatter and frenetic energy of the previous painting. Passengers are leaning their head on the window, nodding off, some quietly smiling to themselves as the landscape flashes by in fragments, little blips of light emanating from the homes and buildings that dot the terrain outside. In the last painting, Those Who Stay, we are back at the train station, and the large, boisterous shapes and loud, warm colors of the first painting have constricted to monotone bluish-green slivers that almost look like rain as the friends, family, and loved ones return back to their lives, not being able to go on a journey themselves. In these paintings, Boccioni tries to capture the atmosphere of these places like he is translating a warped memory of a feeling, or as the title of the series indicates, states of mind. To me, these paintings are like a proto-psychedelia on par with the likes of Alex Grey. 2 years later, Boccioni would create Dynamism of a Soccer Player, the painting that opened this video. Here, he is no longer trying to capture a state of mind, but an exact and expanding moment. Rather than paint the football player himself, as with the sculpture, the colors and shapes reflect the disruption of space carved out by the athlete, his arms arching to balance out his body as his leg rears, winding back to drive a strike. The sun glints off his thigh muscles, while his head bows like a charging bull. And it is so dope. Seeing it on your screen won't do it justice, no matter how big your monitor is. It's crazy to me that Dynamism of a Soccer Player hasn't become one of the world's most beloved paintings. And I used to always wonder why the Futurist art movement Boccioni was a part of failed to get as much recognition as other movements of the time. While Cubism and Dadaism were both disruptive art movements born around the same time, art history has carried them into the present through constantly engaging in dialogue with them over the years, where Futurism spent a lot of time swept under the proverbial rug. And I think the reason paintings from this movement didn't gain more recognition is precisely because the Futurists were all card-carrying members of the Fascist Party. In case you couldn't tell by his name, Mr. Umberto Boccioni was Italian, and during the 1910s when he was producing art, Italy was going through some changes.
Aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto!
And it should be clear, it's not that Futurism just happened to form alongside political upheaval. Fascist ideology very much informed the guiding principles of the Futurist art movement. nor were the artists naive products of their time that didn't fully understand the violence that fascism would come to embody. The Futurist Manifesto is infused with the nationalist fervor that was galvanizing with Mussolini's rise to power.
È dall'Italia che noi lanciamo questo violento, scioccante manifesto. Vogliamo che sia chiamato futurismo, perché vogliamo liberare questo paese da questa putefatta cancrena di professori, archeologi, ciceroni e mendicanti. Con questo vogliamo dire che è ora di liberarla dagli innumerevoli musei che ci assillano come tombe.
The Futurists were part of the same cultural climate that made Cubism so new and exhilarating. Prior to these movements, art was religious, realistic, or portraiture, and leaping upon entirely new forms of expression and calling it art was controversial and often inflammatory. And while Guernica is possibly the most infamous painting to come from Cubism, the most widely circulated painting of the Futurist movement is this. It's just a little wiener dog skipping along its master. I mean, I love dogs, so I'll take it, but it is just a little skippy dog. It's neutered and completely devoid of any political meaning. Compare that to these bright, vivid eruptions of violence depicting actual riots that the artist witnessed and took part in. War, violence, rapid industrialization, and social unrest all greatly informed the Futurist lexicon. Nearly all of the artists of the movement were also enlisted into the army and would go on to paint their experiences. One in particular, Tullio Crawley, was a pilot and would translate his aerial visions from the cockpit to the canvas, inverting everything that the traditional landscape represented. They were enamored with speed and new sensations that came with automobiles and the experience of riding a train, as we saw earlier. Fascism and Futurism were definitely engaging in a symbiotic relationship, each influencing the other. Their art worked as propaganda to inspire Italian men to glorify war, and they donated this new provocative style to the fascist movement. This is a picture of Mussolini's headquarters encouraging people to vote yes or sì for the Nationalist Party. The bold graphics are in line with Marinetti's explorations into novel forms of typography. Boccioni and his contemporaries were charged and full of life, ready to destroy the long-held establishment of centuries of Italian art history, drawing from this new fascist nationalist movement and its disdain for the past.
But look at us! We are untired! Our hearts know no weariness because we are fed with a fire, hatred, and a speed!
But they were also problematic misogynists.
We will destroy the museums, libraries, academies of every kind. We will fight moralism, feminism, every opportunist or utilitarian cowardice. We want to glorify war, the only cure for this world. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and contempt for women.
Whenever I become interested in something, rather than rabbit hole my way through Wikipedia articles, I tend to go on an ebook downloading spree. And somewhere amid searching for books on futurist art and fascism, I came across this book that argues the high-speed times we currently find ourselves in might be similar to that of the 1910s, and rather than positioning us for new and bold forms of art making, which I would argue is already happening, the author posits that the conditions of social media and rapid change are priming us for fascism to creep in. The blurb from the book reads,
"Images come at us quickly, often without context. A photograph of Syrian children suffering in the wake of a chemical attack segues into a stranger's pristine Instagram selfie. Before we can react to either, a new meme induces a laugh and a share. While such constant give and take might seem innocent, even entertaining, this barrage of content numbs our ability to examine critically how the world, broken down into images, affects us. Images without context isolate us, turning everything we experience into mere transactions. It is exactly this alienation that leaves us vulnerable to fascism, a reactionary politics that is destroying not only our lives and our nations, but also the planet's very ability to sustain human civilization."
And while we could interrogate this a bit further, I actually have a different question. And that question isn't, do times of great conflict and upheaval produce good art? Or can we separate the art from the artist? But rather, suspected secret supporters of fascism are deemed crypto-fascists. Militant environmentalists are labeled eco-fascists. Matt Walsh, the ultra-conservative commentator, calls himself a theocratic fascist in his Twitter bio. According to Elon Musk, mask mandates and social distancing were fascist.
This is fascist. This is not democratic. This is not freedom. Give people back their goddamn freedom.
The vaccine was fascist. Barack Obama was a fascist, and so was Hillary. And Trump. Trump is definitely a fascist. So are governors from Florida and strangers on the internet. Even Thomas the fucking Tank Engine is fascist. And of course Paw Patrol is too. And this isn't a new phenomenon either. In 1944, Mr. Eric Arthur Blair, aka George Orwell, lamented that
it will be seen that, as used, the word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. In conversation, of course, it is used even more wildly than in print. I have heard it applied to farmers, shopkeepers, social credit, corporal punishment, fox hunting, bullfighting, the 1922 committee, the 1941 committee, Kipling, Gandhi, Chiang Kai-shek, homosexuality, Priestley's broadcasts, youth hostels, astrology, women, dogs, and I don't know what else.
Needless to say, the word fascist gets thrown around a lot, with a massive uptick in 2016. No one knows why. And today, the word is pervasive in comment sections across all social media platforms. And there are certainly people that one might call a fascist.
Bush is a Nazi.
But are there people that self-identify as fascist? Real people, not trolls or edgelords. Genuine fascists that subscribe to fascist ideology.
Are you a fascist?
Yes. The answer is yes. For the second half of this video, I'm going to briefly speedrun contemporary neo-fascist organizations, and then I wanted to explore why the word is used so often in a way that seems completely disproportionate to the amount of people actually claiming to be fascist. That is, how such a relatively fringe political position became part of everyday discussion and online discourse. First off, the word fascist has similar etymology to another word that begins with F and is used as a slur against gay people. The Italian word fascist translates to a bundle of sticks, but in this case, the bundle signifies that the people of the state are stronger together acting as one than as separate sticks. You'll typically see this bundle in fascist imagery tied together with an axe. According to Fascism Facts for Kids,
fascism is a form of government in which most of the country's power is held by one ruler. Fascist governments are usually totalitarian and authoritarian one-party states. Under fascism, the economy and other parts of society are heavily and closely controlled by the government. The government uses violence to arrest, kill, or otherwise stop anyone it does not like.
After hearing these definitions, you might be inclined to ask, who would sign up for this, right? Who would want to be under a dictatorship and have their freedoms removed? This is why fascism has to lean so heavily upon stoking nationalism and exploiting existing misery. The futurists were drawn to Fascism 1.0 because Italians were in want of a cohesive national identity after its upper half was annexed from the Austrian Empire in the 1860s. And if there is anything fascism offers, it's a strong national identity. Today, neo-fascism's largest draw is in providing a means for men who feel disenfranchised to feel superior through nationalism/nativism, giving them a set of beliefs that implies the purity of their own people and the story of a state which is strong and would be acting in their best interests. This fulfillment and emotional engagement is kept constant through the hatred of other people and ideologies. Liberals, socialists, communists, Marxists, immigrants, and all-around xenophobia, homophobia, and now transphobia. This hatred is then absolved through the mental gymnastics of religion and God's blessing. Wilhelm Reich believes fascism is predicated on exploiting sexual repression, but he's a Freudian, so of course he thinks that. He also has a fun theory that we should all be sluts in order to protect ourselves from fascists that would otherwise prey upon said repression. Okay, quick side note, while I was looking for a picture of this Reich guy, I came across a bunch of his mugshots, found out he invented this contraption for collecting sexual energy, or orgons, which as far as I can tell is just a converted phone booth you jizz in while breathing into a bag. Followed by the Cloudbuster, a modified gun version designed to fight aliens and the weather, using the same jizz magic, which Kate Bush wrote a song about on the same album with Running Up That Hill. He's also credited with initiating the free love movement, and the Food and Drug Administration called him the leader of a new cult of sex and anarchy. He had his books burned by both Nazis and conservative Americans, and was a direct influence and inspiration to the following names, including Neil Armstrong, who wrote an article about him for BBC Culture. His arrest came after the FDA prosecuted him for medical claims on his wacky inventions like curing cancer, and he would die in prison. But he also points out in his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, that fascism exploits what he calls the socialist longing, a condition in which the suppressed masses strive for freedom against their oppressors, a feeling that has been a constant companion of civilization and predates socialist ideology by thousands of years.
The socialist longing of the millions was a longing for freedom from suppression of every kind. But this longing for freedom appeared in the form of a compromise with the fear of responsibility. This fear of social responsibility forced the socialist movement in the direction of the state. In the scientific sociology of Marx, we find nothing about the state as a goal of socialist freedom. The socialist state is an invention of party bureaucrats. It, the state, not the masses of people, was now supposed to introduce freedom.
In fact, socialism and fascism kind of have a lot in common, and it's not a coincidence that they came into being right after the other. Both are in favor of state control, and both tend to flourish in response to rising class struggles like unemployment, financial crisis, and inflation. By harnessing social angst and despondency and the desire for change that they bring. In fact, Mussolini put together his own national fascist party after being booted from the national directorate of the Italian Socialist Party for being too much of a warmonger. And even Hitler was inspired by socialist thought. They both would capitalize on the spirit of social revolution of their day and the longing that Wilhelm Reich describes, further absolving the people of responsibility by placing themselves in charge of the state and thus granting themselves unlimited authoritative power in the process. Other neo-fascist groups in Europe are nationalist organizations with socialist-sounding names and histories, like the Italian Social Movement and France's Front National. Like their predecessors, neo-fascist groups will often present their platform as socialism, as a cover for their goal for authoritarian power or the creation of an ethno-state through the expulsion of refugees and migrants. It's mostly in the US where neo-fascist groups form on the alt-right side of the political spectrum, and even then they employ deceptively leftist-sounding names like the Nationalist Socialist Party and the Traditional Workers' Party. Sometimes you will see neo-fascists advocating for what is called the third position, a kind of counterweight to capitalism and communism, combining reactionary views like a return to the non-existent days of former glory and elements of leftist economics like resource redistribution, plus racism. But when someone gets called a fascist online, it's usually not in reference to any of this. It mostly means racist bad guy or bigot, where the consequential violence that may arise from the bigoted beliefs they espouse is actively implied. But more often than not, it is following a through line of equivalence that starts with traditional and ends in fascist. Bruce Kuklick is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, whose books explore philosophy through a political lens. His latest book, Fascism Comes to America, is an observation on how the term has been used in American discourse across the decades. Prior to social media, Americans have deployed the term fascist as a pejorative against anyone whom they disagreed with politically, though the term has ping-ponged in popularity, depending on who America was or wasn't at war with. After World War I, the term was used heavily against FDR's New Deal, which John Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System claimed was the beginnings of a police state. However, when America rolled into World War II against the United Fascist Front of Germany, Italy, and Japan, fascism reverted back to denoting a foreign evil, and was less likely to be used against everyday people and politicians, having been replaced by the conspiratorial accusations of communism during the Red Scare era and McCarthyism. Come the Vietnam War, things kind of bounced back as anti-war baby boomers who hadn't fought fascism firsthand started reapplying the term to American politicians across the spectrum. Since then, every president from Reagan to Trump, including the Clinton family and the Bush clan, have at one point or another been cast as fascist. According to Cooklick, because of this history, fascism has become what is known as a floating signifier, a word that becomes so void of concrete meaning that it subsequently becomes primed to receive any meaning. For example, while we tend to see the word fascist lobbed at the right from hopefully well-meaning leftists and libs, the type of American fascism calling for national social welfare programs has been framed as liberal fascism by author Jonah Goldberg in his unhinged book on the subject. The book tries to tie common threads between the likes of Hillary and Hitler, equating liberals with Nazis since they both believed in free healthcare, guaranteed jobs, and prioritized public education. As we discussed earlier, socialism and fascism were born of the same social climate. However, fascism clearly hijacked socialism's enticing benefits package and used it to mask their higher goals of ethnic cleansing and absolute power. But Goldberg goes far beyond seizing upon this historical overlap with far-fetched insinuations like Hitler was a strict vegetarian and Himmler was an animal rights activist, and so are the goddamn libs. It's very much giving, did you know Nazis enjoy ice cream? An anarchist friend of mine summed up this book by calling it the crying, clenched teeth Wojak personified.
Bravo.
In the article, Does American Fascism Exist from the New Republic?, Daniel Bessner writes,
The one consistent quality the term fascism has retained since the 1930s is its negative valence. Almost no one uses it positively. Fascism's power in American discourse comes from the fact that it has no stable meaning. It's mostly an all-purpose curse word, a highfalutin fuck this, which means that the fascism debate, as currently constructed, can never end.
Sadly mirroring what Orwell wrote nearly 80 years ago.
Almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist. That is about as near to a definition as this much abused word has come. All one can do for the moment is to use the word with a certain amount of circumspection, and not, as is usually done, degrade it to the level of a swear word.
After discussing how liberals in the 40s strategically evoked the specter of fascism to develop the left-right political spectrum we lean on so heavily today, positioning themselves as the sane, moderate center and heroes of democracy, the article posits 3 reasons on why fascism is a hat that seems to fit so many heads, and currently comes in red. Fascism was never an actual threat in the United States. Living, breathing Nazis within the US are minuscule groups that never came close to gaining real political power.
It was precisely this lack of threat that allowed fascism to become a generalized term of vilification. If there were actual fascists running around, you wouldn't go around calling everyone fascist.
Unlike liberalism and conservatism, it is not a living ideology, nor are self-identified fascists actually taken seriously in society.
There are no genuinely fascist op-ed columnists, no fascist TV commentators, no fascist celebrities, no fascist elected officials.
And when people do use the term, like Matt Walsh's Twitter bio or the white kid that hangs out with Kanye, they're pretty much trolling you into a reaction. And 3, it allows people to indicate that they are the good guys, the non-fascists.
Identifying fascists allows Americans living today to imagine themselves as part of a consequential world historical fight between good and evil. It's an ahistorical framing that gives meaning and provides psychic succor to all of us who have no influence in the corridors of power.
Maybe it doesn't matter that calling someone a fascist has lost its original meaning. Both Cooklick and Bessner, though probably not Orwell, seem to agree that evoking the term has had its benefits in the past, and those that do so are usually well-intended, drawing attention to issues and policies that can cause harm or undercut civil liberties.
Sometimes left-wing thinkers have determined that to impel Americans to confront difficult truths, only the word fascist will do.
But even with that concession, the author of the New Republic article goes on to say,
I have yet to see compelling evidence that indicates invoking fascism leads Americans to confront racialized state violence. Leftists have been using fascism as a term of abuse for decades, and it doesn't appear to have had much effect on how the population understands society.
Based on observation, sometimes it seems like the left does more for fascism than actual fascists and neo-Nazis. Because while neo-Nazis most definitely continue to organize in the present day, their impact is negligible and their reputation is shit. But when a couple dozen show up to a public gathering, they instantly get all the attention and focus they want. Then afterwards and during, they are filmed and posted and shared online, giving them a kind of free publicity, and more often than not, detracts from the original purpose of the event. Then people continue to call politicians and all sorts of other people fascists, and it only adds to the appearance of their reach and visibility. I would say that the word fascist now belongs to the left, for them to apply as they see fit, whether accurate or not. Much like how the right uses the word woke, to call out patterns of behavior they want to chastise or draw attention to, and in a way that will be immediately evocative. And I think they will want to keep their word, even if it is devoid of a precise meaning. And in case I didn't say it earlier, I don't doubt that the people that are deemed fascist are genuinely racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, xenophobic, homophobic, transphobic, and generally very shitty. And I firmly believe that we're going to look back on this time and view what politically right-minded people have done to stir up and perpetuate transphobia as another dark stain on US history. Which is to say that while the definition is flimsy, I don't doubt that fascistish shit is going down, and maybe using fascist as a shorthand label for these behaviors is effective for anti-fascist groups in guiding their work. But maybe without the popularity of the word constructing its impending threat, fascism would lose its standing as the ultimate boogeyman of our nation's future. Because I mean, look at these guys. They're total dorks. Overall, researching this video has left me questioning whether or not there's a kind of fascist panic spreading through the Twitterverse, and wondering if people are giving in to a phantom menace. My personal takeaway is that when we call everything fascist, it makes it more difficult to take legitimate threats seriously. If it isn't obvious, I don't use the word fascist in its contemporary iteration, but a lot of friends and content creators I watch do. And there are multiple organizations doing respectable work under the banner of fighting fascism, so I want to reiterate that I am not a brick wall. I'm definitely open to being wrong, and if there is a better way to be having this conversation, I'm down to have it. Pretty much everything I shared in the second half of this video is recently learned. While I do know a lot about Boccioni, I didn't even bring up his obsession with painting his mother, I don't know that much about the American political landscape. Actually, to close this out, let's turn back to Mr. Umberto. As the title of Futurist implies, Boccioni was ahead of his time. Many of the ideas he would write in the technical manifesto for futurist painters fit surprisingly well alongside concepts from quantum mechanics, which wouldn't be fully developed for a few more years.
All things are rapidly changing. Space no longer exists. A profile is never motionless before our eyes. It constantly appears and disappears. Moving objects constantly multiply themselves. Their form changes like rapid vibrations in their mad career.
And it saddens me to think of what he would have accomplished, since he died just a few years after this manifesto was published at the age of 33. Remember how I said most of the futurist artists had enlisted into the army to fight for the fascist cause? Well, Boccioni did die a soldier, but it wasn't on the battlefield. There was an accident during training camp, and shortly after this photo was taken, he slipped off a horse, fell on his head, and died. A second part to this tragedy is many of the sculptures he produced were lost or otherwise destroyed. Boccioni had originally worked in plaster, which made his sculptures exceptionally fragile. They wouldn't be cast into bronze until a few years after his death as a way to preserve them, with only 3 surviving to the present day. The one I showed earlier, this bottle, and this weird head thing titled Antigrazioso. The rest we only have pictures of. However, a few years ago, 2 digital artists took the 30 existing photographs of the lost sculptures and set out to recreate them with modern technology and forensic analysis. Using hard spatial physics, they began plotting out the dimensions of 3 sculptures that hadn't been seen for nearly a century. Unique Forms was actually the last of a series, an evolution of deconstruction Boccioni had explored. If you're interested in this project, there's a downloadable PDF on their website, which I'll link below, that details their process and the final reception where they unveiled all the sculptures to the public. Which is kind of a happy end to this story for art lovers. Well, that's it. If you're still listening, that's super cool. Thank you so much for watching. This is my first video, so I hope you liked it. If you want to leave a comment about what art you've connected with or who your problematic fave is, I'll definitely go check it out. And if you want to subscribe to my channel, I can guarantee you that as of this moment, I am likely the smallest creator you could possibly support.